right, welcome back. After having spent some time talking about Paul and his background and having a look at Paul's letter to the Galatians, we're now going to move into Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, if you've ever read Galatians and Romans together, you'll just have probably realised that there is a large amount of overlap in the themes and contents between those two letters. And that's why we're doing both of them together. And in many courses around the world, you will find in theological seminaries that Romans and Galatians are done as a pair because of their similar content. As we come into Romans then, what we're going to be dealing with is probably the most influential aspect or document in the New Testament in all of church history. Romans has exerted an enormous amount of influence, probably from the time of Augustine in the 6th century all the way through the Middle Ages and up to the time of the Reformation and since. In fact, you could say that the entire Protestant branch of Christianity is based on a reading of Paul's letter to the Romans. So as we come to Romans then, it obviously comes with a large amount of history, and some of the aspects of that history we're going to touch on as we go through Romans today. Obviously that history is much too large for us to deal with comprehensively today, and Romans itself is a very large and complex letter, so we're going to have to settle for touching on some of the main themes and major ideas and major, I suppose you could say, controversies when it comes to the reading and the interpretation of Paul's letter to the Romans. The first topic, and this is an area where there has been some change in thinking over the last generation or so, is what actually is Romans? If you look at it in your Bible, you discover it's probably titled Paul's letter to the Romans. But I think it's fair to say that for the majority of church history, Romans has not actually been read like one of Paul's other letters. It's quite clear, and we saw this in Galatians, that Galatians was written to a church dealing with a particular problem. It is what's called an occasional letter. But Romans, just because of the way that it reads and what would appear to be an absence of contextual references, Romans has been predominantly read as though this is Paul's systematic theology, that here is Paul presenting a theological treatise which encapsulates his theological framework, or the sum total of his understanding of the gospel, that it's not actually an occasional letter, it is a theological text in that sense. But in, I suppose, the last generation or so, there has been a bit of a shift in that way of thinking, in that we've come to understand a little bit more of the history of the church in Rome itself, and some other things have come to light through historical study, which leads us to think that, in fact, Paul's letter to the Romans may, in fact, be an occasional letter. And if you stop and think about it, that probably makes some sense, even just from when you read Paul's letter to the Romans. For a start, it's got a letter opening and it's got a letter closing. We saw in our lecture on Galatians what a letter opening looks like, and Romans has that letter opening, which makes it look like a letter. And then when you get to the end of the book, all of chapter 16 is taken up with greetings. Paul wishing this person well and wishing that person well, and greet this person, and this person who's with me sends his greetings, and this person sends his greetings, which again makes it seem like Paul is writing to a particular church with a particular agenda. And also, I think, if you stopped and looked at the content of Romans, you'd realise that Paul is not saying everything that he would want to say about all theological issues. He doesn't even talk about many issues that come up in, for example, the Corinthian letters in Romans hardly at all. So Romans can't be the sum total of Paul's theology. It's not a theological masterwork in that sense. It is very narrowly restricted to a certain set of topics. So again, that makes us think that Paul is choosing the theological topics he talks about because they're specifically relevant to his audience. So what are those things that we have come to learn a little bit more about the church in Rome and what might constitute the context for Paul's letter? So here are some things that we know. For a start, we know that around the time of Paul's writing of this letter, which is in the middle of the 1st century, that there's a relatively sizable Jewish population in Rome, around 50,000 people. And that Jewish community in Rome were the descendants of those Jews who were transported to there after the Emperor Trajan's conquest of Rome in 63 BC. So he took a bunch of captives there, settled them in Rome, and those captives settled, reproduced, had children and grandchildren. What we've got in Rome around the time of Paul's letter is a relatively large Jewish population there. We don't know how the church in Rome started. We don't know when it started. There are a range of different theories. That one of them suggests that there may have been Jews who were in Jerusalem at Pentecost who got saved from Peter's sermon, who then went back to Rome and started a Jewish church there. Or maybe some other apostle or some other early Christian leader went to Rome and preached the gospel there and planted a church like Paul did in his missionary journeys. We don't really know. What we do know is that Paul didn't plant the church, and from our reading of the letter, we know that Paul has never actually been there. He knows some of the individuals, but he's never been to this church in Rome before. What we can probably work out from the reading of Romans and other sources is that the church in Rome initially started as predominantly a Jewish church. And so we've already had a bit of a sampling of Jewish Christianity from our reading of Galatians. And even when we talked about Acts in our lecture on Luke Acts, we realized there was a Jewish church as well as a Gentile church. And they are fundamentally different characteristics. So the church that starts in Rome is a Jewish church. And it probably also then accumulated some Gentile believers. The first group of Gentile believers would have been from that group known as the God-fearers. These were Gentiles who were attracted to the God of Israel, and yet because of he was one God, because he was a good and a just and a consistent God, and the moral laws and teachings of Judaism were generally quite attractive. So each synagogue generally in the Roman world would attract a group of Gentiles who were attracted to the God of Israel, but who weren't interested in converting to Judaism completely. It's probably from these Gentiles that the first Gentile converts were made by Paul and by other preachers. So the church in Rome was initially exclusively Jewish and started adding Gentile converts, firstly from the God-fearers and then probably from their network of friends. So there is a largely Jewish church in both population and in character that has Gentiles added to it. Now, an interesting historical event occurs in 49 AD, something that is known as the Claudian expulsion. The Emperor Claudius is ruling the Roman Empire from Rome around this time. And what we've learned from the Roman historian Suetonius is that in the year AD 49, Claudius expelled all of the Jews from Rome. And when we read Suetonius, he says that he expelled the Jews from Rome because of a controversy and because of sort of communal disharmony, maybe even violence, over one called Chrestus. Now, it's quite possibly there that Suetonius is making a reference to Christ. Perhaps it was the case that the larger Jewish community in Rome is facing some internal conflict over the preaching by the Jewish church in Rome about Jesus. And maybe the Orthodox Jewish community is resisting that preaching and causing some social unrest. Whatever the reason, Claudius expels all the Jews from Rome. So what we discover then is that, or what we surmise, is that when the Jewish population, Christian and non-Christian population of the Jewish community leaves Rome, that means that the only Christians left in Rome are now Gentiles, and that they now take on the leading of the church, they take on the preaching of the gospel, they take on the missionary efforts to reach the community of Rome, and the character of the church changes from being a Jewish church to being a Gentile church. Interestingly, 5 years later, the Emperor Claudius dies, and his edict expelling the Jews is rescinded, and so the Jews return to Rome and return to their homes, return to their trades, and of course this would include the Jewish Christians who would have returned to their Christian community, hoping to more or less pick up where they'd left off. only to discover that what was a Jewish church has now become a Gentile church. And whereas before they had a Jewish leadership hierarchy, they've now got a Gentile leadership hierarchy. And it's quite likely then that as the Jews returned, wanting to take up their positions in their church and expecting it to be like they left it, they discover that the church is now fundamentally different. And so now perhaps what we've got going on in the Roman church is a set of ethnically based tensions between the Jewish and the Gentile halves of the church. Interestingly, we find references to these kinds to Claudius's expulsion in the New Testament. For example, in Acts, we see that in Acts chapter 18, it says that Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila, who are expelled from Rome by Claudius. He meets them in Corinth. But then in Paul's letter to the Romans, we discover that Priscilla and Aquila are now back in Rome. And so here we see further evidence of Jews being expelled from Rome, returning. And so perhaps this return has caused some conflict in Rome. And Paul's goal perhaps is to try and speak into that conflict. So the problem, if we wanted to summarize it, may be this, that perhaps the problem in the church and behind Romans is tension between the Jewish and Gentile segments of the church as a result of their recent history. And one of the things that may be fueling this is that in broader Greco-Roman society, there are already tensions between the Greco-Roman or the pagan world and the Jewish world. They're not necessarily always on harmonious terms, so there may already be some underlying ethnic tensions which are now erupting within the life of this Christian community. So Paul's agenda may well be to rebuild unity in the church in Rome, especially between these Jewish and Gentile believers. Now, we might then want to ask, why is Paul interested in rebuilding Jewish and Gentile unity in a church that he has never been to? Let's now have a look at Romans and read from chapter 15. It says from verse 23, it says, "But now there is no more place for me to work in these regions. And since I've been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I've enjoyed your company for a while." What it seems like Paul is intending is that he's on his way to Jerusalem to give over to the Jerusalem church an offering he's collected for the poor saints from the Gentile churches that Paul has established in Greece. He's taking that offering to Jerusalem, and then he's on his way to Rome, and his ultimate goal is to go to Spain and start preaching the gospel there. And perhaps from the text we've just read, we can realize that what Paul wants to do is set up Rome as a missionary base, much like Antioch has been a missionary base from which he launched out for his first 3 missionary journeys. If Paul wants to make Rome a base for a mission to Spain, and by a base we mean a place that he returns to, that funds him, that prays for him, that encourages him, if that's going to be a base for him, then he needs that base to be unified. And it's interesting that at the moment it may be disunified over the issues of Jewish and Gentile believers. And as we've already realised, Paul is actually a bit of a controversial figure in the early church around that very issue. So Paul wants to go to Rome. He realises that they are perhaps divided on Jewish-Gentile lines. He has a reputation for being a troublemaker in that particular topic, so he writes this letter to the church in Rome to help them deal with these issues, for him to perhaps act as a bit of a peacemaker to this community, to remove the controversy that may have attached to his name by reputation, and in the process be able to establish the church in Rome as a missionary base for his efforts to reach out to Spain. So those may be our reasons for why Paul wants to write to Rome, to the church in Rome. What we can discover then is that Romans, rather than being a theological textbook, is indeed an occasional letter targeting a specific issue, namely Jewish-Gentile tension in the church in Rome, in order to achieve a certain pastoral objective. In other words, Romans is very much like all the rest of Paul's letters. All right, so now let's have a look at the structure of Romans. How does Paul actually step out his argument to address the issue of Jewish-Gentile disunity or tension, at least in the Roman Church. So on your screen there, we've got a summary of the overview of Romans, and this sort of follows the standard sort of understanding of how Romans can be broken up into chunks. The first section is chapters 1 through to 4, where Paul sets out to establish that whereas this Jewish and Gentile community are currently thinking that they are separate and different, Paul wants to get the idea across that no, in fact, you are actually the same. And there is more that you have in common than that divides you. And he goes about it in a rather interesting way. In these 4 chapters, his objective, as it says there on your screen, is that to get the idea across that Jews and Gentiles are both under sin, but God has been faithful to his covenant promises, by which through the faithfulness of Jesus, God has created a new family marked out by faith. In other words, you Jews and Gentiles are both sinners. You Jews can't say you're better than the Gentiles, and you Gentiles can't say you're better than the Jews, because you're both sinners. You've both been disobedient. And you Jews, as God's covenant people, you can't go bragging and boasting because your own scriptures say that you are sinful, and your own history proves that to be the case. But even though you have been unfaithful, God has been faithful. And he's been faithful to the promises that he's made his covenant people, the Jews, and that those covenant promises were about how he was going to make one family out of both Jewish and Gentile sinners. And that promise has been fulfilled in Jesus. The second section is chapters 5 through to 8. And this is where Paul sort of takes a step back. Having established that these Jewish and Gentile communities in the Roman Church have more in common than that which separates them, namely they're both sinners and they both need Jesus, he now steps back a step and says, now let me give you an overall picture of the story of what God has been up to since creation itself, that means that you as Jews and Gentiles being unified together in Christ and having received the Spirit, how that is actually the plan that God has always been up to. So in chapters 5 through to 8, Paul's, as we says on our screen here, that we see there the story of God's plan retold from Adam through Jesus all the way through to a renewed creation. In other words, Paul maps out the entire story of what it is that God has been up to in human history from the beginning with creation, fall, through the story of Israel, the coming of Jesus, his own mission to the Jewish and especially the Gentiles, and how that is moving forward to the great climax of that story with the return of Jesus and the renewal of creation. And it's when you see that larger story that you realize where Jesus fits in and why a Jewish and Gentile family, a new people of God made up of Jew and Gentile, is so important to Paul and is central to God's plans and purposes. That then brings us to the third section, which is chapters 9 to 11. Because if you want to restate or reframe the story as being the problem of sin that started with Adam and is going through to a renewed creation, that then leaves a few questions hanging. And ultimately they have to do with the nation of Israel itself. Namely, if Israel were God's people, and rather than being faithful, as Paul has already established, they turned out to be sinners, and then, having been found to be sinners, they reject their Messiah rather than embrace their Messiah. Well, what does that mean is going to happen to the nation of Israel? Aren't they God's covenant people? But not only what is going to happen to Israel, that poses a bunch of other questions. Namely, if the Jews are indeed God's covenant people, and yet they've rejected their Messiah by and large, what does that mean about God's ability to be faithful to his promises? Because didn't God make a bunch of promises to Abraham and to the people of Israel that now seem to have been frustrated, that seem to have come to nothing? That is actually a really big question that deserves an answer, because Paul wants to mount the case that God has been faithful to his promises, but Israel's rejection of their Messiah might seem to be a counterpoint to that idea. So in chapters 9 through to 11, Paul presents an argument which shows how Israel's unfaithfulness to their Messiah falls within the ambit of God's plans and is representative of the way that God has always operated with his people. So, as it says on the screen there, chapters 9 to 11 ask the question, how does rebellious Israel fit into this story? How does Israel's unfaithfulness not undercut God's plan? Is there a hope for Israel? And that's what those 3 chapters are about. So if you've ever asked the question, what is the place of Israel in God's plan? That's the place to go. And then in the final section, which is chapters 12 through to 16, Paul now moves into the practical dimension of how this Jewish and Gentile community might be able to live in a unified way together. In the first 11 chapters, he's presented a theological reason why they should, but now they have to actually practically live that out in day-to-day life. And so chapters 12 to 16 goes about the practicalities of that. And it addresses the question, how does the new family of God, made up of Jew and Gentile, live together as God's people in the world? So those are the 4 sections of Romans. And when you read them, as I would encourage you to do so, if you were to read Romans in one sitting, you would see how the argument flows forward in that kind of way. It is one unified whole, one sustained argument, one sustained rhetorical piece, more as much as a theological piece, to try and convince an audience to take a certain set of steps, to take a course of action which will bring this divided church back into unity. So that's sort of our overview of Romans. Now, in the time that we've got left, I'd like to dive into a few key aspects of Romans and to some of the modern thinking and some of the scholarly controversies that perhaps are involved in some of the key features of Romans. So let's start off then right at the very beginning of Romans. One of the terms that will turn up a lot in Paul's letter is going to be the idea of the gospel. And what actually is the gospel? Many of you would be familiar with the presentation of the gospel that goes much like this. God loves you, but you're a sinner. Your sin separates you from God, and there's nothing that you can do about it. Therefore, God did what was necessary by sending his son to die on a cross for you, and by putting your faith in Jesus, you can have a relationship with God. Now, that's a fairly good rendition of the gospel. Interestingly, there isn't much that looks like that in Romans. By contrast, what we see instead is Paul's presentation of that gospel. And we'll find that right at the very beginning in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. So let's read this together. Starts off, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son, who as to his earthly life was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. So if we were to pull that apart a little bit, we would find the content of Paul's gospel. Paul's gospel contains these ideas, namely that God has made promises a long time ago to deal with some human issue. Those promises are contained in the Jewish scriptures and were enshrined in the life and history of Israel and were talked about through the prophets. And what was it that they were talking about? They were talking about God's Son. God's Son would be a descendant of David, and by the Spirit would be appointed to be the Son of God with power, and that would be revealed in his resurrection from the dead. So that's the gospel as far as Paul is concerned. A story about God's Son, who is deeply enmeshed in God's story and involvement with Israel, was prophesied in the Jewish scriptures, is a descendant of a Jewish king, and is there coming into the world to faithfully fulfill God's promises, and was testified to by the Spirit of God himself as being the one God had chosen by his resurrection from the dead. That, for Paul, is the central gospel proclamation. So that is something worth having some thought about. That for Paul, the gospel is not predominantly about human sin and how you can be saved. the gospel is predominantly about God's Son, Jesus, and how Jesus is the fulfillment of God's plan. Another avenue of looking into that is to come to terms with what is rightly understood to be Paul's thesis statement. And this we find in Romans chapter 1, and it's found around verse 17. So let's have a read of that one together. Paul says, and you're probably very familiar with this passage, he says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Now, this passage, as I've already mentioned, is referred to as Paul's thesis statement in Romans, because it contains many of the big ideas that he's then going to go and unpack in his theological argument for why Jews and Gentiles should live together. Firstly, we'll notice that Paul's not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God that brings salvation to whom? To everyone, Jew and Gentile. What is the basis on which that salvation comes to everyone? Comes to everyone who believes, who has faith. And then goes on to say, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Not so much how we become righteous, although that is an aspect of what Romans is all about, but the bigger idea that Romans is about God's righteousness. And God's righteousness is about how God is going to be faithful to his promises to redeem a fallen world and renew his creation. And that righteousness of God is a righteousness that is brought to bear upon the affairs of this world and the lives of men and women on the basis of faith. Those are some of the ideas that are key into Paul's argument in Romans. And so, as I said, these couple of verses here are an encapsulation of everything that Paul essentially wants to say in this very significant letter. All right, so we've just covered Paul's thesis statement and also had a little bit of a look at what would be the content or the main focus of Paul's gospel. And already this has brought us into territory which is the subject of lots of discussion and at times controversy in the scholarly world over the way that we read and understand Paul. So let me introduce you to some of those. The big one, as you can see on your screen, has to do with the topic of justification itself. What do we understand Paul means by the term justification? And that term justification is a lead into probably even a larger discussion about how do we understand what Paul is on about entirely. And in particular, how do we understand Paul's relationship with Judaism? What are some of the issues that Paul is dealing with here in Romans? And also this is the time to bring back in some of the topics which we touched on in Galatians, where, if you remember, Paul in Galatians talked about the works of the law and encouraged the Gentile believers in Galatians not to forsake the Spirit and forsake faith or forsake Christ and to go to the law. He said instead not to do that. So that would suggest that Paul has some kind of antagonism or at least tension in his stance towards Judaism. And how might we understand that? Because Paul has got opponents in Galatia, and it seems like there may also be in the background perhaps some alternate points of view that Paul is addressing in Romans as well. So let me step you through sort of the history of this kind of idea, because you'll find this in the various readings that you'll do for this subject. Firstly, let me introduce you to what has been the prevailing understanding of Paul since the time of Luther and the Reformation. Luther understood that the issues that Paul was dealing with in Romans and Galatians had to do with legalism. And legalism is that sort of Pelagian idea that you can work your way to salvation, that by doing good works, by obeying the law, you could accumulate merit and that merit might count for something before God. In other words, What Luther understood that Paul was addressing was what he thought was the Jewish idea that the reason the Jews had the law was so that they, through their good works, could earn salvation before God, that they could be justified by their works. And so Luther understood that that's what Paul was opposing, and his understanding instead was that because of what Jesus had accomplished on the cross, that was necessary because people could never earn their way to salvation because they could never adequately or perfectly keep the laws of God. So therefore, an atoning sacrifice for their failure was necessary. That was achieved through Jesus. And therefore, being saved or getting saved was made possible by believing in what God had accomplished in Jesus, because you couldn't do it yourself through good works. So that was Luther's understanding of what Paul was addressing in Romans and Galatians. For Luther then, and for those who draw their lead from him, is that justification then is about how people become righteous. They are made righteous by God on the basis of faith. And justification is about that process of how people get saved. They are condemned because of their failure to be perfect, and they are made righteous on the basis of their faith. In other words, justification is about the theological topic of soteriology. Now, that particular understanding of Luther's, of Judaism at the time of Paul and Jesus in particular, is something that the Jewish community has always resisted. They've always said that that characterization of early Judaism was inaccurate. They would say we've never understood ourselves as trying to earn salvation by keeping the law of Moses. But by and large, the Christian and especially the Protestant community has never really had ears open to that kind of argument. A key step in terms of a change in that point of view happened in the middle of the 20th century with a very influential essay by the European scholar Christus Stendhal. And he argued that Luther's understanding of Romans and his understanding of ancient Judaism was actually more a product of Luther's own guilty conscience. That Luther himself had an overactive sense of his own inadequacy and his own inability to keep God's commands, and therefore he gravitated to his particular understanding of Paul because he understood it as the solution to his own guilty conscience. What Stendhal argued, and I think argues quite convincingly, is that Paul does not display any similar kind of guilty conscience. He doesn't seem to be embracing the idea of grace and salvation by faith as an answer to his own weaknesses. Instead, Paul seems to have a very robust sense of himself, and even when he was a Jew, he seemed to have been quite content in his Judaism. So that was sort of the first blast, if you will, in an effort of reconfiguring our understanding of Paul. The next major step forward, and this is probably one of the most significant works in biblical studies of the 20th century, was E.P. Sanders' book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which came out in the 1970s. What Sanders did was he did an historical analysis of what you would call Second Temple Judaism based on the writings of ancient Jewish rabbis. And what he discovered was the way that the Jews at the time of Jesus and Paul thought of themselves was not like Luther's conception at all. Rather than thinking that they needed to earn their salvation by keeping the law of Moses, they understood themselves as already being God's people. They were already in a covenant of grace with God. They were already saved, if you will. And that when they came to the law was given to them as the way that they walked out their life as God's people. So their life was governed by the law, but their identity is already established in a covenant of grace that God himself has already initiated. The term that Sanders used was covenantal nomism. And so he understood that justification then was not about how you got saved, but justification, being righteous or being made righteous, was about how you lived out your salvation, or in other words, how you stayed saved. In the 80s and early 90s, the English scholar James Dunn He came to this particular topic, especially through work on Galatians. And he argued that the works of the law that Paul talked about in Galatians and also gets referred to in Romans are not the Ten Commandments, but are instead those particularly Jewish practices which mark them out as God's people. He in particular drew attention to the food laws, circumcision and Sabbath keeping, that these were the things that in the midst of the Gentile world, these were the things that identified the Jews as God's people. So in other words, when Paul says that no one is justified or no one is made righteous or becomes God's people by works of the law, what he interprets Paul as referring to is that being justified, being righteous, is not something restricted to people who keep the works of the law, namely the Jews, but justification is available to everybody. The major next step forward in what has come to be known as the new perspective on Paul, a term that Dunn himself coined, it comes with the writings of the English scholar N.T. Wright. And Wright takes on a lot of what Sanders says and a lot of what Dunn says, and he understands justification not to be about how we get saved or even about staying saved. Wright understands justification to be about who can get saved. And just to be justified then, or justification then, is a reference to God's declaration as to who his people are. And the big issue from Wright's point of view that Paul is addressing is the issue of who can be God's people. Is it just the Jews or is it Jew and Gentile? And Wright makes the case that justification then is Paul's effort to explain and to draw attention to God justifies the Jew and the Gentile. Of course it's a gracious justification, of course it's on the basis of faith, but it's not something which is divided by keeping the law or not. It's divided on ethnic grounds as to who can be God's people. So, and Paul, as far as Wright is concerned, is about mounting the case that justification is available to both Jew and Gentile, not just to the Jews. So to perhaps summarise those kind of ideas, it would be the way that the old or the Lutheran perspective understood Romans compared to the new perspective. The old perspective understands Romans as being primarily about how we become righteous. By contrast, the new perspective says that Romans is about how God has acted righteously. That's a rather different understanding about how we're going to approach Romans. Let me give you another area in which thinking about Romans has been turned upside down a little bit, or at least sort of brought into a new frame recently. And this is with the emergence of what you might call apocalyptic readings of Paul. What apocalyptic readings of Paul are about is asking the question, what is the problem that ultimately Romans is dealing with? And so, if you will, there is sort of non-apocalyptic or older readings, and there are newer and apocalyptic readings. So the older readings say that the problem that's going on in Romans, or the problem that God is addressing, is the problem of personal sin. That the enemy in Romans that God is trying to deal with is the flesh, namely the individual human sin nature. That God is wanting to save people from hell, and that ultimately justification and what God has done through Jesus is about solving those problems. The apocalyptic way of reading Romans. And the reason it's called apocalyptic is because it bases itself on old Jewish ways of thinking about what God was up to in human history, in that it was anticipating a time in the future when God was going to step climactically into Israel's story and bring things to a great resolution. And so apocalyptic readings of Romans say that what Paul is really talking about is that the problem that God is dealing with is not so much the problem of personal sin, but of global or cosmic evil. In other words, that the problem God's trying to solve in Jesus is the problem of evil that has now dominated the world through the fall of humanity. That the flesh that Paul poses as the opponent of God's people is in fact cosmic sin, this world force of sin that is ruling and dominating God's fallen creation, that yes, holds individuals in slavery and takes up occupation within the individual humans, but ultimately the great enemy is the flesh, this cosmic force of evil that dominates the world. And that what God is ultimately after is to save and renew creation. That it's not just about saving individuals and escaping them out of the world and taking them to heaven, that ultimately what God is after is to redeem and renew his whole creation, which includes humans, but indeed everything that God has made. So these apocalyptic readings, which first came to light through the writings of people like J. Lewis Martin and Douglas Campbell especially, and N.T. Wright also gets a Guernsey in this regard, is reconfiguring the way that we read Paul by making the scope of what he's about to be much, much larger. It's not just focused on humans, and it's not just focused on humans' individual sin problems, but it's actually about what God is doing to save his entire world. So that is also a transformation or another factor that has come into our reading of Romans in recent decades. So what we've done so far is we've had a look at Romans, we've had a look at it as an occasional letter, we've had a look at what the issues may have been going on in the church in Rome that the letter is addressed to. We've looked at why Paul might be wanting to address those issues in terms of his own missionary agenda. We've had a look at how Paul approaches the issue, how he marches out his argument across Romans. We've looked at a couple of key features, but we've also identified some key big topics or key areas where ways of reading Romans has become a little bit more controversial in recent decades. You're going to find those ways of thinking and the ideas that come with them in your readings when you read commentaries or articles or introductions to Romans. So we covered those today so that when you encounter them, you realize what's going on. And ultimately, those new ideas are symptomatic of the fact that Romans is such an important letter, an important document in Christian theology and church history, that lots of scholars are involved in trying to ascertain what really was Paul trying to say to his historical audience in his first century context. So it's fair to say that whilst there has been a long-held traditional point of view, there is now an alternate point of view which is really sort of has taken the field in recent decades. And you need to be aware when you read Romans that these two ideas are out there in the scholarly world and are now increasingly presenting themselves in popular teaching and popular writing and even in the preaching that you'll encounter from time to time.